Hi there, welcome back to the channel. In the last video, I talked about the principle of understanding new content versus memorizing it and the importance of that. In this video, I'm going to talk about the practical principles that I use in order to develop that understanding rather than just memorizing. Now, the first and most useful approach that I find for doing this is taking what I call a question-driven approach. So what this looks like is whenever I'm learning some new content, whether that's at home, doing some studying from a textbook, or if I'm in a lecture, I will always force myself to be thinking of as many questions as I can about the content that I'm learning. So as soon as something enters my mind that I don't understand, or if they present a topic and I wonder, well, does that apply to this other area? Then I'll try and think of a question that highlights that gap in knowledge. And that's really what's most useful about this question technique is I'm actively searching for things that I don't understand. And I have a pretty low threshold for these questions, so it might be a pretty stupid or basic question. It doesn't really matter. I will just write it down, and then at the end, I'll have this list of questions that I can work through. I don't always find this easy to do. It is a bit of a mental effort trying to force yourself to think of questions, but I do find that when I am able to do it, I'm paying much more attention to the content and I do pick up more of it. And then when I next have a period of free time, I will spend time proactively looking for the answers to those questions. If it's in a lecture, I might then ask the lecturer a question. If I'm in the library or I'm at home, then I'll spend some time researching it, and I'll just look at all the different sources that I can to try and answer these questions. So it might be looking at the lecture notes, Googling it, trying to find that video that explains the concept in the way that helps you to understand it. And more often than not, there is somewhere out there a fantastic YouTube video explaining the concept, blessed as we are in this modern age of the internet and YouTube. So it's just a case of trying to find where that is. And I heard somewhere an analogy that this question sheet acts as kind of like a cow prodder for your mind, where when your mind kind of wants to relax, you're continually pushing it saying, well, do you understand this? Do you understand this? And that then leads you to constantly, your brain to constantly be trying to think of what is the answer to this question, or what's the next question that I can try to answer. And the place that I found this technique was most helpful was when I was studying things that were very conceptually difficult. So in my machine learning degree, there's lots of content that's very mathematical, and because I don't have a formal mathematical background, sometimes I find I'm getting quite overwhelmed by the concept. I don't just feel 1 degree away from understanding it. There are so many points between where I am now and actually understanding this concept that I find it quite easy to get overwhelmed and just not really know where to start in terms of actually getting to the point where I understand this conceptually difficult mathematical points that they're trying to explain. In those situations, the thing I found most useful is using this question-driven approach and trying to iteratively build up that understanding to then get to the point where I actually understand this very challenging concept. What that looks like is I will just try and think of as many questions to highlight different areas that I don't understand, answer those each in turn, and eventually I get to that point where I finally feel that I understand the concept, and it's an amazing feeling. And then what I'll also do, if I found that it was a particularly challenging question, or if it's a question that's useful to remember the answer to, then I'll keep a reference of that question, and I might keep a reference of the answer that I discovered for that question, so then I can always refer back to that in the future. And if it gets to the end of a study session and I still haven't answered that question, then I will store that as an unanswered question that I'll then work on in the future when I next come back around to reviewing that topic. And that's one thing I find useful actually, and I'll talk about a bit more in a later video, is the importance of actually restricting the amount of time you spend on a subject, because I think that's more efficient rather than just kind of spending as long as it takes to understand it. I prefer to take the approach of spending a certain amount of time and trying to get as deep an understanding as I can in that time, but being prepared to not fully have developed the understanding that I want on that subject, having some unanswered questions, but keeping those questions there so that when I then come back to it, I will focus on trying to then go deeper and develop the understanding of those questions. So I'm going to show an example of some questions that I made for myself and the answers that I wrote and how I kept that as a review. So towards the start of term, I was studying the concept of logistic regression, which is a key concept in machine learning. And I was writing some questions for myself because there were some areas that I wasn't entirely clear on. And these are the questions that I wrote. So I wrote myself, could we use linear regression to create a classifier decision boundary, and what would that look like? I then wrote myself a pretty long answer here, as you can see, with some screenshots. So these are some screenshots from Andrew Ng's course, which, as an aside, if you're interested in machine learning, that is a phenomenal course to check out. It's just Machine Learning by Andrew Ng. But here you can see I've kind of written some notes to myself answering that question. This one's a particularly long one. And then some other questions I had, so why use sigmoid functions to separate points? And that's kind of already explained. Why use different loss functions? What purpose do they serve? And I've made some brief notes here. And what's useful about that is I'm now confident that I understand the answer to those questions, and phrasing them as questions and identifying those areas where I didn't fully understand it was super useful to enable me to then know what question I wanted to answer. And I now have that as a very useful reference. So if at some point down the line I kind of get a bit confused, or I ask that question to myself again, then I can always just look back at this and I can scroll through and be like, ah, yes, okay, I remember exactly what the answer to that question is. And I have a pretty reasonable explanation to myself from my past self about how that question question works. Anyway, I feel like I spent quite a long time explaining that, but the question-driven approach is phenomenal and it's a personal game changer for me. There's some other popular approaches to trying to identify the areas where you don't fully understand a subject. One of them is this idea of asking 5 whys, which apparently is something that the founder of Honda, I think, said was something that he always used. If there was something new that he learned, he would always ask why 5 times. So let's say somebody says the stock price of Tesla is undervalued and it's going to go up. You would ask why, and they might say, because the electric car market is going to increase dramatically. You might say, why? And you're like, well, because there is a switch towards using more sustainable modes of transport, and therefore that will become popular. And why is that? Because people are becoming more conscious about the importance of protecting the environment. And kind of in the process of that, then you will identify some of the assumptions or perhaps some of the areas where your understanding is not complete. And another example of this is something that's dubbed the Feynman technique. And this is a technique which involves first trying to take a concept and explain it as if you're explaining it to a 5-year-old. The idea there being that you explain it in as simple terms as possible to enable them to really understand. And if that's difficult, that might identify an area where you don't fully understand the subject. And then there's approaches that you can take to then resolve that. But yeah, I think all of these points are just trying to reiterate the same thing, which is that we should be seeking to develop understanding rather than to memorize things. I'll put links explaining all these things in more detail in the description below, so check that out if you're interested. And so once I'm happy that I've developed understanding to the level that I'm able to in the current study session, I'll then look to consolidate that understanding in a way that will maintain the understanding for the long term. And I'll explain the process I use for doing that in the next couple of videos.